This is the subject of the talk. I can skip that in the interest of time. I think you've already read the summary if you're here now. So we're going to talk a little bit about why it's a hard problem, and the reason it's a hard problem, and a couple of quotes in here you'll get tired of seeing by the time I'm done, is that the thing that Lucene actually works with is an abstraction of the raw data. Nowhere in Lucene is it required that you store the raw data. The thing that goes into the index is some sort of function. You know, Robert Muir's quote here is wonderful. Y equals f of x. Y is the thing that goes into the index. X, the thing that the function operated on, is the raw input. Lucene does not necessarily preserve the x. So there are some things you simply cannot do because the information is not there when it comes to upgrading an index or to changing an index unless you re-ingest the raw data. This has always been true that that Lucene has never formally supported two major revisions in the back, two major revisions backwards. Lucene X will be able to read and work with Lucene X minus 1, but not X minus 2. In the past, that's been kind of a silent failure. You'd get some odd relevancy calculations, you'd get some things that didn't work or just kind of really hard to track down. As of Solr 8.0, that's explicitly enforced. And explicitly as in, if your index that has ever been touched by Lucene 6 or earlier, it will not open in Lucene 8. And that's despite index upgrade tool, that's despite optimization, that's despite rewriting your entire index. We'll talk about some of the reasons why that's became explicit. Lucene doesn't know a thing about schemas. Schemas are a higher level abstraction imposed by Solr, Elasticsearch, any other app that uses Lucene. To really understand why this is a particularly thorny problem, we're going to talk about segment merging. And that's the first half. And then we're going to say, okay, there actually is a solution, but be prepared to code. We did this once, Andre and I. Andre, are you here? Well, rats, because then he can't tell me that he can't back me up and tell me the things that he knows that I don't. Anyway, we worked on this. We found a way to add doc values to a field that did not have doc values originally without having to have access to the original content. We did not have enough time to track down why you had to stop indexing. There were some subtle failures that would come through if you were indexing simultaneously with doing this operation. We didn't forward port it, another one of those time and energy things. If people have a desire to, there's no reason why this code could not be put into Solr. I mentioned that this y equals f of x thing is a problem. That said, there are a number of safe transformations that I can imagine being pre-canned. So you do some things with your Solr config, press a couple magic buttons, and we can do some of these safe transformations. If you take on this task yourself, do be aware that you're messing with the low-level Lucene indexes, and you be prepared to actually understand those and do quite a bit of time actually making that work. The primary point is Lucene is a lossy abstraction. There's no schema. What happens in Solr, the way the schema is imposed is just carefully constructing the nested character filter, char filter, tokenizer, token filter, token filter, token filter, token filter. And those are constructed in a very precise way that realizes your schema. Lucene has no idea what you're doing. It just says, okay, you instantiate me this way, I'll write my index this way. Lucene doesn't care if any two documents have the same field. You could theoretically construct a Lucene index in which no two documents had the same field. It'd be a silly index, but you could do it. Lucene doesn't care. The whole notion of unique ID, the unique key that you define in the schema, is entirely imposed by Solr. Solr essentially says, I got a document, I got a new ID. Does this ID exist in the database? If so, I'll tell in this index, If so, I'll tell Lucene to delete it, and I'll add a new one. So that whole notion of unique key, for instance, is actually imposed at a higher level. And that's why, that's part of the reason why index changes almost always require re-indexing. So show of hands here, how many people have been on the users list, et cetera, and say, I want to change my schema. Can I just change my schema and index my documents and have it all just work out? And the answer comes back saying, no. Go find your source code, your original gold copy of your data, and reindex from scratch. This one in particular has been kind of interesting. Doc values have added an awful lot of flexibility, reduced the heap requirements of Solr, and people don't know they want to do that until too late. And then we say, yep, reindex from scratch. People change from single value to multi-valued. How many people have seen the log error, found, sorted set, expected, sorted, blah, I quit? Raise of hands, come on, how many people have seen that? Okay, and the answer has been, change multi-valued to single valued and reindex from scratch into a new schema. When you delete fields, that's fine. I can imagine that being a safe transformation, but just deleting a field from an index doesn't actually make the underlying data disappear. So I delete a field from a schema, I reindex all my documents, and at minimum the metadata is still associated with the segments. We had a situation where there were, through a programming error, there were over 1 million fields defined in the documents in the index, and they couldn't get rid of them. They could get rid of the content, the data, but the metadata that was carried around, you can't get rid of. Another safe transformation. And in a case where you can't get to the original data and you have to upgrade past 2 major versions. But that said, the subject of this talk is how not to have to do this. Plan on doing this if at all possible. It'll save you a world of hurt for a number of reasons. In particular, it will save you a world of hurt when your product manager comes back to you and says, oh, by the way, we're changing functionality, change the index, change how it works. Well, okay, you probably have to reindex from scratch. I usually do not believe in reading slides, but I'll read this one. The key issue is that Lucene is an index, not a database. Because it's a lossy index and does not retain all the UDA's data, it is not possible to safely migrate some things automagically. That's a quote. The function's f of x, and if x is not available, you can't recompute y. And therefore, you can't update the index as required. Mike McCandless. By the way, Robert Muir and Mike McCandless are some of the primary architects and coders at the Lucene level. Believe what they tell you. This is really the difference between an index and a database. We do not store precisely the original documents. We store an efficient, derived, computed index from them. The whole point of Lucene is to be able to search. Let's make it as efficient as possible, but we derive data to put it in. Sure, Solr Elasticsearch can add database-like behavior where they store all of the fields. And if you store all of the fields, you have all the original content, you can reindex everything from what's in your index. You don't have to go back to your system of record. On terabyte, petabyte scale installations, that's often not practical. Especially if you talk about a Solr, an index with lots of shards and 50 replicas each, you're replicating terabytes of data across 50 different times. You just have problems scaling at that level. I'm going to talk about segment merging in brief. I hope this is old hat to almost everybody in here, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. Segments are write once. They're merged over time as more and more documents come in. It's a complex calculation about which segments ought to be merged. Tiered merge policy is the default. You can change it. Merging segments when a field is changed is unsupported, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And if I rush through this and I get done early, we can do questions, and with an audience this size, I'm sure that'll take as long as we want. So imagine you have 2 segments, multi-valued true, multi-valued false. We're down at the Lucene level. Lucene does not have access to the schema. It doesn't know what you meant, what you intended. And now it says, what should I do with these 2 segments? One has a bunch of fields with multi-valued true, another one has multi-valued false. Well, I could create a rule. A rule could be, I'll take whatever's in the first segment, that's my definition. I'll do whatever I can to munge the data, make it conform to that, and I can write the new segment as whatever, according to whatever definition was in the first segment that I saw. I could try to look at 6 or 7 segments and average it. All of those things are wrong. Changing from multi-valued false to true, I can imagine doing that. That's not hard. The resulting documents would just be a single valued set. No trouble. The other way, not a chance. Do I take the first value? Do I concatenate all the values together? Any of those decisions are wrong. Now I start to multiply that by, do I have term frequencies? Do I have positions? Do I have blah, 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 blah? And the cross product of all of those things, and you start saying, no, this is just an intractable problem. Practically, theoretically, you could do it. Practically, you all want to be using new versions of Lucene and Solr, so we're not going to go there. That was a decision at the Lucene level. New major versions. How am I doing? Oh, okay, I can slow down. The guarantee has always been one major version back compatibility. Lucene 6 can be read by Lucene 7, Lucene 7 by Lucene 8, etc. What has never been formally supported, and no attempt has been made to support it, is Solr 6 reading a Lucene 4 index, or Lucene 7, 5, etc. Anything x minus 2 or more. People look around and they say, oh, look, we've got this cool thing called the index upgrader tool. Let's use that. I will run index upgrader tool on my 4x index to 5. I'll take the Lucene 6 index upgrader tool and run it on my new Lucene 5 index, and that should upgrade to 6. And then I'll do it to 7, and then I'll open it with 8. Wrong. In the past, this has looked like it succeeded, but back to Robert Muir's f of x quote, there's no guarantee that that index that's now been put through these multiple transformations actually has all the characteristics of a true Lucene 8 index. So as of Lucene 8.0, if you try and open that index, Lucene will refuse to start. Your searcher will refuse to open in Solr. You will not be able to function at all. So I spun through a lot of stuff really quickly, so can I take questions on that? Is this something people have seen? Sure.
So what value does the index upgrader tool have?
In my opinion, almost none.
So why do you say re-indexing all documents will not help?
We're going to talk about that. That's back to the segment merging slide I had. Okay, I'm sorry. The question was, why do I say that re-indexing all the documents won't help? Because along the way, you hit this problem. I'm re-indexing all the documents to an existing document. New document comes in, old document gets deleted. I keep doing that, and eventually, those segments get merged. The segment is merged before it's empty.
So what about we running the re-indexing without taking new document? Would that work?
No, because there's a couple of problems with that. One is you cannot guarantee from a Lucene perspective that every document's been replaced. It's just a segment merge process. You know you've indexed the entire corpus. Lucene doesn't necessarily. So it's carrying along this information, the segments, as it merges them and merges them and merges them. And the Lucene people have to say, you know, I can't guarantee that it's going to be right at the end, so I'm not going to try. In re-indexing all the documents, if you're going to be able to re-index all your documents, the answer from my perspective is actually fairly simple. Create a new collection, index to that collection alias over to it, done. Avoids all of the problems. If you can re-index from scratch, and this is on the very first slide, plan on that for major upgrades, would be my advice. We can talk afterwards about, I can go way down in the weeds because this conversation can go on for about an hour and a half. And has when I've talked to the Lucene people. Be aware that as of Lucene 8, I said it won't open an index created 2 versions ago. Well, the way that's enforced is when a segment is created, a version stamp is put in the segment. When 2 or more segments are merged, the earliest version stamp is preserved. So I don't care if I've merged and merged and merged and merged these. If my index has ever been touched with Lucene 6, some of my segments eventually will have this Lucene 6 marker. As of Lucene 8.0, if any segment has that marker, boom, no open, you're done. It will not work. Make sense? And again, I want to emphasize that this is a formalization of something that the Lucene developers have always known. That is that they strive very, very hard to maintain one major version backward compatibility, but couldn't guarantee 2 major versions backwards. It's been kind of one of those things that the developers know and will tell you after you start running into trouble that that's what happened. So this is an effort just to fail early as opposed to fail subtly. whoops, Robert's quote. You'll see that this is the last time you'll see this, but you'll see Michael McCandless's quote. And the reason I repeated this is this crystallized for me what the problem was. And it actually made my understanding of why this kept recurring as a theme. It actually kind of brought it to focus, and I can say, okay, I understand this, at least theoretically now. Because, I'm sorry, when you start talking about, and this is a problem with engineers, right? When you start talking to people like Robert Muir and people like Mike McCandless, they will start talking about all the code reasons why this thing doesn't work and how difficult it would be to maintain in the code. And often I'm sitting to myself saying, I don't care. I just want to know what the problem is you're trying to solve that you can't solve. And this is exactly the problem. This always happens to me, by the way. Oh no, I've saved my minute. I think we're okay now if I keep going at this pace. All right, let's now talk about how to get around this problem. I want to emphasize at this point that getting around this problem is in certain restricted cases. You absolutely have to bring to the problem your knowledge of what you're changing and why you're changing it before you can do this safely. This is a great way to mess up your index. So understand that if you're going to go down this path, it's a development project. Initial development, troubleshooting, making it actually operate on your system, seeing if you did it right, testing it, et cetera, et cetera. This is not a cheap solution. So if at all possible, back to what I said on one of the very first slides, plan on reindexing. If you can't, and in some situations you simply cannot, this is an option for you. And I do also want to say that I can imagine some things we can put in Solr that would, and Lucene that would allow you to configure some things in your config file and go ahead and press the button and make all this stuff happen. But we haven't put it there. And by the way, if anybody really desperately needs this, come talk to us afterwards. We'll see if we can do some things about actually putting it into Solr. So here are some of the use cases that I can think of that are actually worthwhile or actually safe. Doc value is true if you have the indexed or stored value. The key to this, and the way I want to think about especially doc values, in the old days, if you wanted to sort, group, use a function query, et cetera, on a field, it made more sense to use what we call a doc values structure. The inverted index is a wonderful way to say, for a term, what documents are in it. It is a rotten way to say, for document X, what's the value of the field. So what you would do is we call it uninverting. All of those tokens are in the index. That's what you're sorting on. So, okay, I can go through this thing, do a table scan, and essentially create an uninverted structure saying for document 1, the value of field X is this value. That's happened since, I think, Lucene 3. It's been around for a really long time. The point of the matter is that in that case, Robert's X is irrelevant in the field. What you have the actual value is the thing that was in the index that we've been uninverting for a decade or more. So hey, why don't we just write that out at index time so we don't have to recompute it on the fly and use up heap space. The thing I want you to take away from this digression is that the processed value, the Y that you need, is already in your index. So hey, why don't I write something that's able to go through my entire index, do this uninversion process on each segment, and just write it out as part of the new segment, and boom, I've added doc values to my field without having to reindex. Remove data associated with an unused field. This could be the case even if you don't reindex your documents. I say this field is gone, go through my index, rewrite the entire thing, and just remove all the data associated with it because I want my index to be smaller. There isn't any X at that point. You're just saying, Y equals null. Multivalued false to true, or in some cases, vice versa. So I can imagine a case where I said multi-value is true, but I only ever store one value in the field. It was just a mess up when I created the schema. That kind of situation, I can safely go the other direction from multi-valued to single-valued. Single-valued to multi-valued is safe. I've got the token, it hasn't been processed. I just make a singleton set for all of my documents. This is fuzzy, and understand it's fuzzy on purpose. Anything else you can imagine in your index where you can guarantee that the inputs you need to calculate Y are available in your index somehow. I don't care how, just somehow. You're going to have to go in there and pull out the bits and bytes and make the transformations, do anything necessary. But if the information is there, we can use this technique to get around it. Roughly equivalent to an optimize in time and execution. You're going to rewrite all the data in your segment. You could, if you're extremely brave, do this. Say, okay, I'm just going to read all those segments. I'm going to write them back out. When I write them back out, I'm going to change the checksum, change the label, tell everybody it came from Lucene 8 instead of Lucene 6, and Lucene will open it. If you do that, don't call me, please. Suffer. I'm being a little lighthearted here, but you really are getting into dangerous territory at this point. I will add one minor change, and that is that if all you're doing is doing Boolean calculations, you're not doing relevance calculations, this is less of a problem. So here's the use case that Andre and I worked on. We had a client. The client had literally thousands of collections that they did not control. They were doing this as a service. Their users were more or less sophisticated and more or less read the manual, and more or less tested it, and more or less this, that, and the other thing. At some point they had to say, okay, you have to reindex all your content to do this thing efficiently. To make matters worse, these clients shared Solr JVM. Depending on how things were distributed, you might have more than one client using a single having replicas in a single JVM. So client X out there has a whole bunch of data, and they decide they're going to sort one day, and they've never sorted before in a field. Okay, Solr will busily run through, or Lucene will busily run through and uninvert the document, or the field. And then heap blows up, and every client who's actually using that JVM is hosed. So they have this use case where they have massive numbers of collections, massive numbers of things to do, and they can't tell everybody to reindex. They literally cannot do it. And I will add as an aside, by the way, there is a new option in Solr, uninvertible equals false, that you can put on a field. So if you do have that situation where you have to tightly control memory and you don't want somebody who doesn't really understand what's going on here to ever be able to do this kind of thing, you can have Solr generate an exception if they ever try and use an operation on a field that requires uninversion. So you know it exists. Go look it up in the new ref guide. It will be the default in 9.0, I believe. So okay, so we can do that. All the information is necessary. So if we can make a process whereby we can go around, we can just rewrite the entire index, essentially conceptually take each segment, write it new. As you're writing it new, add the doc values to it. You can be done. You have to do it for all segments. You can't skip any. And in this particular situation, remember they have thousands of collections. So I don't really want to tell Solr I don't want to do something like change my Solr config file, and these have shared config sets. I don't want to change my configuration file, press this button, and have thousands of collections start optimizing their indexes or start doing this entire rewrite at the same time. So ideally, I only want to do it with one collection. It still involves rewriting all the segments, so it's costly. So here's what we do. We create a new config set with doc values true. We have this custom merge policy that does stuff. And stuff is to be defined. In this case, add doc values. Temporarily override the config set. So what happens here is you write a collection property. You'll see an example in a bit, saying my collection now uses this very special config set, or this very special merge policy, actually. No other ones do. We overrode the optimized process. At some point, remove the override. This is all done, so we ran the forced merge. Now we go and undo that property that we set that uses the very special config set. And I would also then point my collection at the one new config set you're using. So you got 1,000 collections. I have 2 config sets, old and new. I override the merge policy while the collection is still pointing at the old config set. I run my operation. I then point my collection at my new config set and take away the property. So instead of having to have n number of config sets, you now only have to have 2 in this case. And so one of the does stuff is something called uninvert doc values merge policy that's available out of the box, but you have to make use of it, you have to use it yourself. Next thing. So I said, right here, I said, temporarily override the configured merge policy, one collection at a time. So okay, first I've gone through, I've decided I understand everything I need to do, I can do this thing. This merge policy is the bridge between Lucene and Solr. I mentioned earlier that Solr doesn't have, or Lucene doesn't have any idea of schema. But you're writing up to Solr level, which has all the access to all of Lucene at a very low level. So I can say, okay, I can read the schema and discover what the change is. That tells me what to do. I can go ahead and compare the definition of what's in the segment to what's supposed to be in the segment and do the right thing at the end of the process. It's not easy. As I said, Andre wrote, how many of you are familiar with the Luke index beast? Andre wrote it, the original version. So the fact that he, with some help from me, really couldn't get this to work when you're simultaneously indexing at a fast rate tells you that that's a hard problem. More from his, because he had trouble than me. And we ran out of time to actually chase it all the way down. And the client was willing to say, okay, I can suspend indexing for a particular collection while I do this. That's okay. Find voice merges. Now here's what happens in an optimize in general. And by the way, the Lucene folks hate optimize, absolutely detest it. So they call it find voice merges. And the reason they hate it is, well, there's a long story. There's some blogs in this deck, and we can get you the blogs at various points about all the gory details about why it's so horrible pre 7.5, but we won't go there right now. What this method does is it returns a list of segments, a list of segments. There we go. Each list, sublist, is going to be a new segment. So if I'm going to combine segments 1, 2, and 3 into segment 10, I will simply add 1, 2, and 3 to one of my lists. I will add 4, 5, and 6, and 7 to the next list in this that comes out of this method, et cetera, et cetera. There are heuristics in the normal find forced merges to say, well, do I need to merge this thing? Especially in 7.5, if there are no deleted documents, this segment may be skipped. You have to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's why you're overriding this so you can return all of the fields. Guarantee that you are. And do please, a little technical thing, a couple of the links that I'll provide at the end are, will show you why this is probably a good idea, but I won't go into that now, it's not important. This was the kind of subtle thing for me. You have to provide this thing called a codec reader. So Lucene is down there, and it's saying, I'm going to write a new segment, so go tell me what the contents of the old segment are for this thing, and that's called a codec reader. So I can create my own codec reader that does whatever I want to. I can say, you're asking me what the value of this field is for doc X, Y, or Z. I can go out to the database and get an ACL list. I can stop and wait for a user to press an OK button. The possibilities here are absolutely unlimited. The point is that Lucene, through a lot of callback magic, will use your codec reader to get the values for this operation that you're doing, whatever that operation is. And then at some point, you have to make sure that the segment files are written out. How are we doing? We're back to being almost exactly on time, so we'll have time afterwards. So now I have to make it available to Solr, but this is just a jar file. People who've written custom code know about reading jar files, so I can just copy it up to Zookeeper. And if you set your configuration correctly, this will be available for all of your Solr nodes in the cluster. I can use something like Puppet or Chef or any of those kinds of tools to be able to push that jar out to every Solr instance that I have and put it in the right place. So when I put a live directive in my Solr config file, it can be found. I would always develop this standalone, by the way. It's just much easier. But for standalone, drop it in the right directory, add a lib directive to Solr config, and then go ahead and and fire it off. This is an expansion of one of the steps that I said earlier. We have to let, and this is my custom merge policy. So I go ahead and set a cluster property. This is not a collection property, it's a cluster property. Saying, okay, this is actually the name, and I put my collection name at the end of it, so you need all of this prefix. Tell it what the class is. This is just something that exists in this jar file that I just put up there. I'm going to reload the collection. I want that thing to be read. I want that thing to be made active. Yes, optimized. There's a rant here. We'll rant about it some other time when you're not use up your valuable time for my rant. And then wait. It's got to be done sometime. And I do hope you're doing this on a test system the first few times you run it, just to make sure your code is doing it right. Once that's done, I go ahead and remove the cluster property. I do the modify collection to point to my new config set that contains the new definition if necessary. I reload the collection and I drive on, move on to the next collection.
Remember we changed the modified merge policy. But once you already migrate your data to the configuration, should we reverse back the merge policy?
Well, the merge policies now may be doing a lot of extra work, so I don't want to keep that thing around. That's also my custom code. It's not going to be forward compatible, etc. The merge policy is working just fine if the schema that you've defined matches what the index already has in it. So the idea is you change your schema, you do the merge policy thing to make your existing index match your new schema, and then you want to take all of that extra stuff out because you don't want to maintain it going forward, etc., etc. At that point, your new collection matches your schema definition, and the tiered merge policy is just fine. There's no reason to have your custom code in the mix. And again, we can talk in detail after. But and I have full sympathy, by the way. This is a lot of information. If you haven't been down at this level before, it can be kind of bewildering. What you're going to take out of this is I'll get those slides and I'll go back over it and I'll ask questions on the users list and we'll go from there. But it's possible. Okay, so override find forced merges, decide that which segments have to go into the list. Please don't write into one large segment. My rant snuck in here in several places. I return this list of segments to be merged, and the union of all the lists that I return from this find forced merges should be all of my original segments. You absolutely must rewrite all of them. If you're not indexing, you're probably this is all you need. Press the optimize button, which comes to find forced merges, which does this magic stuff. Two of the blogs I promised, 7.4 and earlier had some real problems with optimize. So you want to read that for what happened there. 7.5 takes a slightly different approach. Those are two background blogs that would be very well, that I think are very valuable, because I wrote them, if you, before you dive into this process to kind of understand what the background is. Once again, reindex if possible, but this is all going to be unique. Whatever your transformation is, I think there are a series of canned transformations that could be quite safe, could be handled out of the box by configuration, but most of the rest of them are going to be things where you have to make a judgment call about whether this change that I want to make is really going to affect my results in a way I don't like or not. And that's not an easy thing to answer. How many of you have seen the explain process, query blah, 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 ampersand debug equals query? How many of you have had your eyes glaze over by that text that's put out at the end of it? If you're not willing to understand every step in that explain, then you're playing with, then determining this is going to be hard. So again, I don't want to scare you away, but I do want to scare you. Don't imagine this is something you can just kind of do in an afternoon. You can do your own readers. You can do a lot of interesting bits in the underlying Lucene code. So there may be other things that you have to do. We kind of cheated a little bit. Can never remember how to pronounce her name. Christine, Poersche, one of the committers, already put some code in place that we were able to leverage. And she also cheated a little bit because the whole notion of uninverting a field was already in the Lucene code. So you can see you can build on some things there, but we didn't have to write that part. Again, active indexing, please don't. There's a whole complex set of things that go on about some segments are on RAM, they get flushed, they sometimes get added to they get added to the list, they may not quite get added to the list yet, and we think somewhere in there it's very hard to coordinate and ensure that you're getting all of the segments you expect. Didn't have time to chase it down. You are at low level. Be aware that you are you're working with code that has been coded up by a bunch of really, really, really bright people. And the Lucene, or the McCandless and Muirs of the world are very rare. These people put in finite state transducers, they pack variable length integers, they twiddle bits in Java. It's a development project. You all should know that development projects never finish on time and under budget. I think I've made that point enough, right? Back to Mike McCandless's quote. The key bit here is it's an efficient derived computed index. It's not the original code that lives in Solr, that necessarily lives in your index. There's no guarantee that you have to store any field. So the original input may simply not be available. My short list of things that I think could be done. This is a kind of a repeat of one of the very first slides that I had. And finally, in case you haven't figured out already that I really kind of feel strongly about this, reindex if possible. And I would argue that you have to plan on reindexing in any application or staying with the current version of Lucene and Solr forever. And even worse, the current functionality of your application. Inevitably, your product manager is going to come back to you a year down the road and say, wow, there's all this new stuff. Why don't we make our application do this thing? And well, okay, I'm adding new fields. So maybe so you're going to have to think about reindexing or somehow accommodating that kind of project and product change. All that said, you might find you have no other choice. And in that case, this is a high-cost solution, but not as high cost as being stuck on Lucene 3 for the next 3 decades. This is a little plea for anybody who really wants this functionality to go ahead and talk to us afterwards. We'll see what we can do about getting this kind of thing in the code base. And this is how open source works. There's a pain point. Somebody's willing to put the development effort in to fix that pain point. It's close. It's very close. Could almost be put back in the community, but it needs some polish and it needs some use cases or some sponsorship. Next person comes along and says, I have a similar problem and we could probably leverage this other thing, so we'll add this next capability. And I can envision this going as those use cases I mentioned increase, that eventually you start adding another and another and another piece of this kind of functionality into the Solr code base. And finally, the thing to take away is that there are a limited number of these. You simply cannot make a generalized version of, take any old version of Lucene and upgrade it to any new version of Lucene. Robert's f of x, it's not there. And I finished with 53 seconds left over. But sometimes the way I finish is by talking really fast. And by the time I'm done with that, nobody knows what I said anyway, so they think I'm great. Sir. Good. So the question is, could this be valuable for reindexing machine learning values? Something in my document, basically. Absolutely. Your Roberts X is not there, you're providing it. So you can do it, so you could, and this would be a very expensive way to like update a single field in Solr without having to reindex everything else. Oh, Kevin.
You would consider this more triage than something you want to implement on a regular basis?
Like on a regular what?
Implement it on a regular basis in production, so you've got it running periodically.
Oh, okay, yeah, so it's kind of building on the other gentleman's question here. Sure, I can imagine doing this every night with my newly computed values, or every week, or every whatever period you want it to be. Sorry, I've got a couple questions from you, so I'm going to go to the back for a minute. We'll talk afterwards. Ma'am. Sir.
So I was wondering, is there any impact on the segments or like regular reindexing process?
I'm sorry, any impact on the?
Regular reindexing process or the segments after we are done with this custom solution once?
Okay. So once this is, maybe I'll restate the question and then we're probably done. Okay, I'll restate the question is, once this is done, what's the effect ongoing? Well, this is where you have to be a little bit careful, and the operations that you do to rewrite the segment have to be compatible with, have to express the changes you've made in your schema file. But at that point, as far as the segment merging is concerned, that's always been the schema. It was just like normal. There's no extra impact. Okay, thank you all very much. I'll be hanging around outside, and I'll try not to intrude on the next speaker.